as I say, welcome this morning, everybody. Today we'll be shortly beginning the webinar. Just to start with, a brief introduction on behalf of the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. Just a couple of things to highlight that are on the agenda, on the horizon, coming up very shortly in terms of events. It's our Festival of Business throughout June. So this is a series of events designed to connect and promote collaboration between members. So do have a little look. There's regional events going on. There's international events going on. So lots happening. And actually our global trade conference is within that period as well. I believe it's on the 23rd of June. So if you're involved in international trade, please do have a little look for that, and please book on via the website for the 23rd of June. And one other thing just to briefly mention before I hand over to our guest today, it's also the Chamber Annual Awards. Applications are currently open for the award categories. We want to continue to recognise all of the great work businesses are doing in the region. So please do have a look. The event's on the 27th of July, and applications are open till the 4th of June. So still a little bit of time to get those applications in. But we're here today to talk about tax and research and development credits and how you can claim money back, basically, because again, it's been a tough time for business. We at the Chamber certainly recognise that. The last 12 months have been unprecedented, and I know that phrase has been used quite a lot recently. But we recognise that at the Chamber. We're here to support, help businesses, as are Azets, our partner for today's webinar, and they're here to help you along the way from a tax perspective and accounting perspective. So I'm going to hand over shortly to Jenny Bramley, who's a partner at Azets in Birmingham, and she'll be able to talk you through this. Obviously, if anyone does have any questions or queries, please do use the chat and Q&A functionality for that. And we'll make sure we get the contact details as well shared should anybody have any follow-up questions that they want to go through. And they will also be in the post-event email as well. But without further ado, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Jenny. So if we could start the PowerPoint, that would be great. Thank you.
If we move on to the next slide. Firstly, I wanted to say thanks to Charles for the introduction and to the Chamber for inviting Azets here to present to everybody today. It is still a little bit odd presenting remotely because I'm a pacer. I like to pace around the room when I'm delivering a lecture, so it feels very odd to sit still here today. But I have been told there's somebody on hand to tell me to sit down if I do randomly wander around the room. We're going to talk today about R&D incentives, and I just find this topic thrilling. It's a real privilege to be involved, to see all the new products and the technical advancements, and to help company with funding. And as Charles quite rightly mentions, it's been a very difficult year for people, and R&D incentives has definitely been helpful to quite a fair few clients that I know that I've been dealing with. In terms of innovation, I think that everybody appreciates that it is important, and the Chancellor has regularly referred to innovation encouraging businesses to develop, looking to attract talent into the UK and to retain it, and to encourage entrepreneurs. He's made it clear in his recent budget statement that he wanted the UK to be the best place in the world for high growth, innovative companies. And I know he's launched consultations, which are going to close early next month, to just find ways to keep us internationally competitive. Now, with all that in the news and the headlines, and I think that it's safe to say that R&D relief is going to be with us for a while, and doesn't look to be being withdrawn anytime soon. And it is one of those topics that at the moment it's relevant and it's beneficial and it's financially more rewarding to companies which a lot of people would say is not typically a statement that goes hand in hand with tax. So we're going to focus today on looking at an overview of what R&D is, whether or not we qualify for the R&D. We'll talk about some of the risks that people pertain in making claims, and I'm going to briefly touch on some COVID-19 impact. And then, as Charles rightly says, we're going to end with any questions that people have got. So if we move on to the next slide. So in terms of why, I wanted to start this with a discussion really about why businesses make claims for R&D and why people do R&D. I could have started with technical information and qualifying criterion, but to be fair, I wanted to talk about why people actually do R&D. What better place to start than that? And I think, we will unfortunately get to the technical information, but I think when you look at the reasons why people do and undertake R&D projects, you'll understand why so many tax advisors out there and even the revenue believe that the claims are not as high as we would have expected them to be. So in terms of why R&D, we all accept and it's understood that R&D exists for pharmaceutical companies or tech giants like Samsung and Apple. But the rationale as to why companies undertake R&D is typically the same across all sectors, all industries, no matter how big and what size companies are. And that tends to be profitability and business sustainability. Constant evaluation of current products and processes is key really to any business's survival, and owners typically do this as a matter of course. They're going to look at whether their products are still profitable, whether there's inefficiencies in how they're developed, whether a cost-cutting exercise needs to be taken out. I've seen a lot of companies move towards sustainable resources or recyclable products. And safety improvements that are required. And the final thing that I see, to be fair, quite regularly is legislative changes that mean that a product or a process has to be changed. Now, we want to be on trend. We want to be moving forward. We want to have a viable business. And by making these changes, then typically that can lead to R&D. I think most people appreciate now in business, and things have been very difficult, competition is fierce, standing still really isn't an option anymore, because standing still in business typically means that you're going backwards. So when people look at their processes and products and make changes, then the chances are they're looking at doing some R&D. And the phrase I typically try to coin when I'm talking about R&D is, did you make any changes? And if so, were they challenging? Now, if the answer to that is yes, then likely there is R&D to look at. So if we move to the next slide, we can see whether on, how many claims are actually made. This is the Midlands, 6,500 claims made across the Midlands, with an average claim total of 150 grand and tax relief of circa £30,000. The most recent statistics we have is for 19, and it states that there's 6 million SMEs, so that's the small medium companies in the UK, and only 52,000 claims were made. Now, that's less than 1% of companies in that small medium sector that are suggesting that they're doing R&D. And I think that you can see really that with the type of projects that may qualify for R&D in terms of new projects and new processes and moving with the times and the trends, that is probably woefully underclaimed and underutilized, this relief. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a summary here. I mean, this slide could be 10 slides, could be 100 slides of where we find R&D. I mean, it really is R&D can be within any industry and any sector. So I've got an example of a few there: furniture, masonry, winery. I think the only important point to note about this slide is the fact that I've managed to pull in 2 alcoholic examples as the very first on one slide. So that probably tells you a bit more about me. If we move on to the next slide, we can look at, let's move on to an overview of what R&D is and the background to it. So in terms of making a claim, who can make a claim? Well, you have to be a limited company, so that does exclude sole traders and partnerships. It does have to be a limited company, and strangely enough, you do have to carry out research and development activities and spend money on those activities. And the company itself has to be a going concern. Now, there are other factors and things and criteria to look at, but those ones I've just touched on are the main criteria. And I think when you get to the end of this presentation, if you think this might be relevant, then we can obviously help anybody discuss whether or not a claim exists and the other criteria are met. So how do you go about making a claim? Claims are made on the company's tax return. So that is typically an annual process, but the revenue do allow a 2-year window for making a claim. So if you feel that there has been some projects that may fall within this regime, then feel free to contact us, and we can look at going back a number of years just to make sure that you're not missing out on that. So if we move to the next slide, I can look at an overview of who qualifies for the scheme. Now, there are 2 schemes within R&D incentives. There is a small and medium-sized scheme, the SME scheme, and that is where the majority of companies fall. And there is a scheme for everybody who sort of doesn't meet the SME definition, and that's called the RDEC scheme. Now, that is a little less generous than the SME scheme, and by definition, if you do not fall within the SME scheme definition, then you would be within the RDEC. So in order to qualify as a small and medium enterprise, a company would have to have fewer than 500 employees and either an annual turnover not exceeding 100 million euros or a balance sheet gross asset total of no more than 86 million. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus the majority of the information that we talk about on the SME scheme, just purely because that's where the majority of typical clients sit. So if we move on to the next slide, we talk about what we can actually claim under the scheme. So we're looking at enhancements of 130% additional tax relief on all qualifying R&D costs. Now that's typically for profit-making companies, but if you're not a profit-making company, then you can claim a payable tax credit, and that's paid at the rate of 14.5%. And an RDEC scheme is calculated in a slightly different way, but it equates to 13% of the qualifying expenditure. And strictly speaking, it's roughly 10% of every pound spent is returned as part of the scheme. So if we move on to the next slide, just to sum up the reliefs, it sounds complicated, but the majority of companies either fall within 25 pence relief or 33 pence for every pound spent on qualifying activities. And those claims can be used in a number of ways. You can use your relief under the R&D to reduce profits. You can use it to create losses and make carryback claims, group relief claims, or carry forward claims, or you can take a cash credit if you're a loss maker and there's a cap on that was introduced in April of this year, and a combination of all of these things. And I think once you've identified projects and costs and enhancements, then as an advisor can talk to you about the best way to use all of the relief to maximise money to come back to the company. So if we move on to the next slide, I've got a couple of examples here. I've got an example for a profit-making company and one for a loss-making, which I'll get to in a second. But these figures are very specific. I'm not sure why. I must have felt very excited to use a calculator that day. But so if a company who makes a profit spends staff costs £130,000, material costs of, let's say, £20,000, they would have total qualifying R&D costs of approximately £150,000. Now they would get enhanced relief at 130%, which would take us to roughly £195,000. And that would reduce our taxable profits and give rise to a corporation tax saving of circa £37,000, which when you calculate it backwards equates to 25 pence in the pound for every pound spent. If we compare and contrast that to the next slide, which is the loss-making company, using the same figures, we've got the £150,000 of qualifying R&D costs, which gives us now a qualifying spend of £344,000, because that's calculated at a higher rate of 230%. And we can then apply to the revenue for a payable tax credit of circa £50,000. And again, that reverse back equates to 33 pence for every pound spent on R&D. Now, as you can see from these examples, it is a generous relief, and typically it's not so much a question of shall I do R&D as am I already doing R&D. And if the answer is that you're already undertaking R&D that qualifies, then it's just a relief to be taken as an advantage. And a claim really should just be made, and we should speak to an advisor to help us. So if we move on to the next slide, in terms of the qualifying, I'm going to run through the qualifying points for R&D. According to the revenue, there needs to be a specific project which is into a new process or a new product or a service, or to improve an existing product. There must be seeking to achieve an advance in the field of science or technology, and they must seek to overcome uncertainties. And according to a competent professional, the project must require systematic research or investigation. And finally, the project must relate to the company's trade, whether that be an existing trade or a new trade or even a new startup. Now, I'm coming back to this, this comment that I made initially, which was, have we made a change to something or created something? And if so, was that change challenging? If it was, then likely R&D exists. But in terms of identifying our projects, we identify them, and then we have to be able to demonstrate and to explain how that project did in fact generate an advance, and how it had to overcome these uncertainties and the methods used to overcome the uncertainties. And we need to be able to evidence that a competent professional really does believe that there is an advance in the field of science or technology. Now, it sounds complicated, so we're going to break it down into the three main elements here, which are: what is an advance? What's the concept of overcoming uncertainties? And who is this competent professional? I think once we've got those three things identified, everything else sort of slots into place. Now, in terms of, we start with advance. In terms of an advance, it means an increase in overall knowledge or capability in the field of technology and or science, and it is important to consider that in the field, because it cannot be just an improvement in the company's knowledge alone. It has to be in the field of science. So an innovative product isn't necessarily enough. It has to be an advancement in the underlying technology. And typical examples of advancement can be new products, more efficient products, processes which generate less waste, cost improvements, or even technology to duplicate existing products in certain circumstances. Now, just to give some examples of qualifying projects, and I'm going to use HMRC's examples, just purely because, firstly, I'm not going to give away anybody's confidential intellectual property, and secondly, to demonstrate that the revenue do want to be helpful. They want people to take up these claims, and they do give a lot of guidance as to what is qualifying. So if a company seeking to develop water breathable fabric for use in hiking, and that's the example that they give, and they create a test fabric to develop via qualifying R&D, and that is a qualifying activity, because we've got a new product, it's an advancement, and we've overcome some uncertainties. Now, once that company has developed that breathable fabric, it decides that it's going to undertake a trial with hikers to see, you know, how they like it, whether there's commercial potential, whether there's appeal to the users. Now, at that point, if you run through the steps, is there an advance, is there uncertainties? I think the answer we can all agree is no. They're just looking at commercial potential, so there's no advancement there, and at that point there's no R&D. However, as a result of those trials, a few of the users said that they didn't like the feel of the material and they didn't like the shiny appearance, and so the company decided to investigate variants of new fabrics, and they decided ultimately to make changes to the fabric weave and the physical structure to overcome these issues that were mentioned. And at that point, now we're back into an R&D project, because we have a specific project, there is an advancement, and we have some uncertainties to overcome. So in terms of advancement, it doesn't have to always be successful, because the technology can be too difficult. So failed projects do still qualify. In fact, they are really a strong indicator that if you've got failings, that it is challenging work, and therefore it is R&D. And even if the advancement that is sought isn't fully realised, then R&D still can be claimed. And a really good example of that is where a company would seek to increase, say, the battery life by a significant level, but only actually achieved a marginal improvement. Now, because it was seeking to generate a significant increase, it would still qualify for R&D, even though it was unsuccessful in getting there. And the final example, I think, that's relevant for advancements is that it doesn't have to be an improvement on the performance of an existing product or process. And that is something that people struggle to understand, because we always think of R&D being something bigger, something better. But the example that the revenue give is that if there's high fidelity, well, there is high fidelity audio equipment already in existence, that wouldn't prevent an R&D project being undertaken to create a lower performance piece of equipment, as long as there was technical improvements along the way of that project. So maybe they were looking to lower costs through more efficient circuit designs. That would still qualify as an advancement. So I think there's quite a lot of scope for falling within the advancement category. And then we need to identify our uncertainties. And really, uncertainties are just part of the project that we don't know how to achieve. We don't know when we start, whether or not they're possible, whether it's even feasible, how to do it. And so it is, it's more than fine-tuning and tweaking. It's something that we can't readily deduce how to do it on day one. And the example, which I quite like this example, it's really interesting. On the basis of a company decides to make a new active ingredient for some weed killer, which is an advance in science. They're going to put it into a commercial weed killing product. So they're all advancements, fine. But what are the uncertainties? Well, they're going to run a program of investigation by a computer to pick likely ingredients. They're going to do some systematic testing based on the trial ingredients. They're going to adapt some existing software to tackle the problem, and they're going to test the ultimate end product for toxicity to various animals, wildlife, humans, and all of those are the uncertainties. So we have a project, we have some uncertainties to overcome, and so that's how we identify our uncertainties. In terms of this competent professional, somebody who has to be actively engaged on the project, sufficiently experienced in the role and in the industry, and somebody who has looked at existing evidence that's publicly available to make sure that the project that you're looking at is something new and does represent an advancement and is challenging, i.e. they don't know how to do it on day one. So they're the 3 points. So if we move on to the next slide in terms of how we can take those main 3 points and look at it in terms of our company. Have we considered whether or not we've made change to products? Have we considered new services or new products or new processes and new systems? Have we undertaken an ad hoc one-off project, which may be automation of something, or it may be a new software system? All of these are good ways of looking for R&D projects that may qualify. Once you've identified whether you have any of these items or these projects, then you really just ask ourselves the 3 steps. Is there an advance? Were there some uncertainties, things we didn't know how to achieve? Was it challenging? And would a competent professional in our field say that they didn't know how to do it and it did represent an actual advancement? Now, I've added the 2 items there at the bottom, appreciable improvements to existing products and replicating existing products, because they are the questions I get asked the most from clients when I meet them. So I thought I'd just run through what they mean. In terms of an appreciable improvement to an existing product, what it's basically saying is that you can claim R&D for existing products if you make improvements, but these improvements do need to be more than simply minor or routine improvements. They have to be genuine and non-trivial. And a competent professional does need to be able to say, yes, absolutely, that was something over and above a tweak. And an example, which is quite interesting, that the revenue give, is with regard to a DVD player. So a company undertakes some market research into what characteristics a DVD player should have. Well, market research doesn't meet any of the criteria, so it wouldn't be R&D. However, the results of the research suggests that there's quite a fair few technological improvements that people want, and the competent professionals, i.e. the staff, have determined that they're going to create this DVD player with these improvements, and they're more than genuine and non-trivial. They are genuine, non-trivial improvements to a DVD player. So any work to generate this new improved DVD player would be an advance. And if we move to looking at replicating existing products, a lot of companies do try to replicate existing products. I mean, we have a number of clients who do this, maybe to save costs or maybe to avoid patents. They may generate the product in a different way. So it is possible to actually make a claim for R&D for producing and developing a product that's already on the market. And you'd have to meet certain conditions to fall within a qualifying project. And they would typically be where, I mentioned before, if there was a patent, so you had to develop the product in a completely different way. If the information was a trade secret and therefore not readily available to other people, so therefore they'd have to start developing it from scratch, and basically a fundamentally different method of developing that product. But a routine copying of a product would not qualify. So undertaking development to achieve the same results but in a fundamentally different way could be classed as R&D. So if we turn on to the next slide, once you've identified your projects and you determine that they do qualify, you can look at working out what the qualifying costs are, i.e. what we can claim. So the majority of the claims that we look at are made up by staff costs, so salaries, national insurance, pension contributions, and reimbursed expenses. Subcontractors and consumed items, so raw materials, anything that's wasted in the process, and some software. And I think the major point here is that you identify the projects and the people working on the projects, and you look to maximise the claim. Now, that's something that we have a lot of experience in terms of helping our clients not only to identify the qualifying projects, but also to be able to demonstrate which sections of that project we can make claims for in terms of staff costs, pulling together comprehensive information in terms of reports and confirming what can be claimed and providing information to the revenue on the basis of how those costs were calculated. So if we move on to the next slide in terms of the risks, the majority of people I speak to who are a little wary of making claims tend to fall within this category of risks. So they may feel that they've got a claim and they're doing some R&D, but they have a concern that they're going to have inquiries, they're going to attract the attention of the revenue, they may have to repay the benefit, all sorts of concerns. And I mean, I wouldn't sit here and say that there are no inquiries raised, because clearly that's not correct. And we do know that inquiries are on the rise. However, what I would say is that by using specialist advisors, people who are experienced in pulling claims together, and who have professional staff leading the claim compilation, we can try and minimise any issues with regard to inquiries. And on top of that, if there was ever to be inquiries raised and spot checks issued, which sometimes are just purely random, then at Azets we have a team that are experienced of dealing with inquiries, and we have a very good relationship working with revenue. So we look to resolve any queries efficiently and with the best results for our clients. So I'd like to say, and I say to all the companies that I deal with, that you're safe in the knowledge that any claims that we submit, if there is ever any inquiries, we would look to handle that on your behalf. In terms of recent tribunal case, again, this leads to making sure that you're utilising a professional firm to do your claims, because a recent tribunal in October ruled that 6 out of 7 projects that had been lodged in a claim just were not qualifying. And I think a lot of that spanned from lack of information being documented in respect of that tribunal case. And so that's where, when working with a professional firm like Azets, we would go to you and work with your team to make sure that all of the information that you need in order to prepare a robust claim and all the supporting document is there, and so that, again, hopefully avoid any concerns or issues from HMRC inquiries. Turning to unscrupulous vendors and poorly documented or exaggerated claims, I think it should really go without saying that exaggerated claims should be avoided, and using vendors who don't offer full support and packages is probably not in anybody's best interests. Not only from nobody wants, I suppose, to be asked for their money to be repaid because the claim's incorrect or overstated, but on the flip side, I've seen quite a lot of claims that have been prepared by people that have not maximised claims either, that conversely I'm saying, well, you probably underclaimed this, but you're now out of time to correct this. So it's sort of looking at it from both sides really, but using somebody who's experienced, who has a specialist team is definitely the way to move forward. And time consuming, that is a lot of people's concern. Is this going to take me a lot of time? I'm very busy, and I can understand that. Well, I think the answer to that is, you don't get anything for free, but if you work with a team who is experienced in collating these claims, we can work with clients to try and minimise the time that they're involved and help out with lots of things. And we can find a way that works best for the clients. Lockdown has been an eye-opener for many companies in terms of who and how we communicate. And I was reading actually yesterday a news article that stated that the BBC had questioned the UK's top 50 companies, and 47 of them stated that they were not going to bring employees back into the office on a full-time basis after the restrictions were lifted. And I think that just demonstrates there's new ways that people want to work. And here at Azets, we're happy to work with people in whichever way suits them, whether that be in person or whether that be virtually. But whichever way we would work with people, we try and minimise the time that they will spend. But I think that most of my clients would always agree that the benefit of making the claim far outweighs the time that they're going to put into actually working on the calculations and the reports. And then I thought I'd talk briefly about the interaction of the support packages, because if we'll move on to the next slide for that. As a result of the pandemic, I think everybody's can appreciate that there's been struggles, and the government has introduced support packages, and other institutions have introduced support packages in terms of grants and various opportunities. Now, although these packages are extremely important cash injections for businesses, and I'm clearly not suggesting that people shouldn't accept them, but there is a possibility that some funding can impact on R&D claims, and that could be for past claims, present claims, or indeed future claims. So what I would recommend is that if anybody believes that they are undertaking any R&D projects or are currently making claims, and they did receive any financial benefits, whether that be the bounce back loans or the C-bills, that they should contact an advisor just to run through whether or not that is likely to have impacted on their R&D incentive claim. And I suppose the most important point to mention here is in terms of the calculation of an R&D claim. I mentioned previously that the lion's share of any R&D claim is typically the staff costs. And with the introduction of the CJRS and furlough of staff, I think that there was quite a lot of information in the press about how furloughed employees were not allowed to work, and that was just very important. And if you are not allowed to work, then clearly you cannot be overcoming uncertainties in an R&D role. So we've spent a lot of time, me especially, in liaising with clients for current claims as to how to ensure that we address that issue as part of the claim, how we can extract the information and not include people who have been furloughed, but B, drilling down really into the figures as to, what has actually happened. I was speaking to a client last week who they'd furloughed some staff, so we'd reduced the claim. But when we got into the details, it was actually quite interesting to note that because turnover and sales had reduced, that the members of the team who had stayed working were in fact doing extra work on the R&D. So we were able to compensate some of that loss. And it is important that these factors are A, identified, and B, explained to the revenue. So I'm not going to spend too much time on running through all of the different schemes. Again, I just suggest that you talk to an advisor about that as to whether or not there's any impact. And if we move on to the next slide, I understand, and I'm sure most people here understand, that R&D is company specific and can be confidential. It does lead to intellectual property. So I'm happy to take any questions, but also happy to take informal one-to-one discussions, or for people to contact me outside of the presentation if we can be more specific on your case, because what I don't want is for people to feel that they can't ask the questions because it's confidential to their business. But if anybody does have any questions, then I'm happy to take them now. I'm going to hand back to Charles.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. That was a really detailed overview and insight. And as we were going, actually, this morning, I was reading about kind of innovation figures, and there's a lot of work going into, as we recover as a region, where innovation, or what part innovation plays. And of course, this is all linked to that. And us as a region, as leaders, kind of supporting companies and businesses on that innovation journey is really important. So really thank you for your time and Azets' work in this area, supporting SMEs across the region in this. So no, great, really detailed, lots to digest. And building on that point, we often hear Birmingham was the city of 1,000 trades, and continues to be. We've got the creative quarter in Digbeth, and there's lots happening on kind of film production front as well. So there's definitely companies that maybe don't even think, oh, we're doing this, that could benefit here. So that's what this is all about, creating that awareness and building that understanding. So no, great presentation. Thank you so much. I just before, I don't know if we've got any questions, but please, everyone that's attending today, if you do have any questions now that you wanted to pick up, by all means, share them in the chat, and we'll pick those up. If not, as Jenny mentioned, she's more than happy for you to reach out and contact her with those directly. One thing I was thinking about whilst you were going through, there's so many intricacies that I think, like you touched on, that there could be uncertainty from people looking at this, like the hours that you might have, or people might have done, the staff might have done. Is that how precise? How careful do we have to be, or does a company have to be in looking at a claim to say, oh, I've got members of the staff, but actually on that particular month, I could say that this particular member of staff was working full time on this project. Is that something? How careful do you have to be with that?
Well, the revenue don't actually call for comprehensive reports, so they don't expect people to keep timesheets of every moment spent on R&D. What they do ask for is some evidence, and typically they ask for meeting notes of, when people are undertaking projects, they typically have a meeting. It might be an informal meeting whereby you say, how are you getting on with your R&D? Oh, I'm there. Oh, I've got this problem, or this problem's arose, or we've sorted this problem. And those meeting minutes they pretty much ask for, and anything that can support the time that's actually being spent on the projects. I think once you've identified your uncertainties, what you're trying to achieve, it sort of moves towards identifying the time that people have spent. And the majority of our claims, we work out on a percentage, really. We take a view of the project, who worked on that project, how much time do we think that person spent on that project, and calculate it out that way. As long as we have you know, a methodology that we can explain and justify to the revenue, then that's fine. And we try to include quite a lot of information in our reports to the revenue, just to make sure that they can identify that we have in fact looked at this. So that would be a bit of a chat with the team, just to identify, you know, the time spent.
No, brilliant. And one other thing I was just going to bring up, in terms, I think you touched on this a little bit with one of your last slides. But if a company has taken financial support, whether it be in, you know, throughout the lockdown period, whether it be through the loans or grants available, does that impact any of this?
Yeah, I mean, it can do. The revenue issued guidance during the lockdown to basically say that there shouldn't be too much of an impact with CBILS or bounce back loans, as long as any of the grant funding or the funding that was issued didn't have any specific mention to the projects. So if the money was received as a general pot to be used for general trading purposes, and that would be fine. Whereas if, when somebody submitted a claim for these types of support, they specifically stated it was for this project, which was an R&D project, then unfortunately you may fall foul of some rules. But again, it is quite client specific and project specific, really. So you need to have a look at the actual documentation just to make sure we get that right.
No, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for that. We've got a few questions coming in through the Q&A, which is great to see, and also the chat. I'm going to turn to one of those. Antoinette asked, if you were to work with a university to carry out research, would this still be possible? I'm assuming she means there, if you were to go and you know, if you were an SME and you maybe partnered with a university or used university facilities, I think they're called incubators off memory. Where does the land lie there? Can you still claim even though you're using a third party to support you?
Yeah, you can work with other, again, specific there's quite specific rules, and you need to get to the nitty-gritty of exactly what's happening and what the relationship is between the parties. But yes, you can work with third parties, and I think there are special rules that you need to meet in terms of working with universities. So it's worth sitting down with people individually to run through that. But yeah, you can still make a claim as long as you meet certain conditions. So yeah.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Antoinette, for that question. Moving down across, we've got one from Nick Biden. Have you considered how R&D tax relief integrates with or is affected by patent box? So that's all new to me. So I'll come to you for that one.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we as advisors, yes, we get involved in patent box as well, and it is a very complex topic, patent box, and yes, R&D does absolutely interact with patent box, but I think that would be a whole new presentation in its own regard, to be fair. So if anybody does have patent or is looking to achieve a patent, then what we would say is get in touch with us directly, and then we can literally run through the benefits of patent and how it will impact on R&D claims. It would take me another hour to go through all the patent box rules, unfortunately.
Brilliant, thank you. And got a final question at the moment in there. How do we, this is from an anonymous attendee, how do we expect R&D incentives to change moving forward? So a bit of a crystal ball moment here. Do you believe things will become more generous or stricter? So I guess if you've got a link into government policy box here, and again, of course, we as a chamber do a lot of campaigning in the region for businesses. So this might be an area that we can put information to them for. But from your perspective, yeah, what are you thinking?
Well, the revenue, the government has introduced a number of consultations, and one is running as we speak. It will close early next month, and the consultation, I think, is just to make sure that everybody feels that the regime is is sufficient, is easy enough to understand, and they've asked a number of questions of advisors, so we're all making comments on the back of that, but they're suggesting whether or not the claims should be made more simplistic, whether instead of running two types of schemes, the SME and the RDEC, we should just have one, whether it should be a flat percentage, whether it should be individual percentages. So I think that there's a very strong possibility that there will be some significant changes in the not too distant future when the results of the consultation are released. But personally, I don't see there being a reduction in any relief. I think much more likely to go the opposite way. Obviously, they're trying to attract talent into the UK, to retain talent in the UK, to create innovation, and they're not going to do that by restricting relief. So I would have no reservations really of saying that, fingers crossed, there's no real reduction in the rates of relief, but possibly it may become somewhat more complex. They always say they're trying to simplify the tax, but it tends to be more legislation and more complexities in my experience.
Yeah, I remember when I was at university doing my law degree, we were handed the kind of UK tax laws and legislations, and believe me, it was more than, well, it was the thickest book in the library, let's just say that. So that shows how kind of complex a tax system we have, and of course, Azets are well placed to advise businesses on all of those complexities.
I think that's the point, really, to make sure that you are getting advice from somebody suitably qualified, who's got lots of experience, who can walk you through how this works and hold your hand through the process. And we have a specialist team that focus purely on R&D, so everybody who works in that team is qualified or training. We undertake ongoing training, and we have a good working relationship with HMRC. We're part of the consultation group that works with HMRC, so we do get information earlier than possibly other people. So yeah, all I would say is, if you think you've got a claim, speak to a specialist.
That's a great point that kind of segues into our next question, which is from Pete West. Question is that he regularly meets companies who are not claiming the maximum they should be, as many do claim through their accountants. He goes on to say these companies are often put off using R&D specialists due to the charging structure. So what do you say to these companies to convince them to kind of use a specialist rather than their accountant? I mean, I think that's the question around what would you say to make companies or direct companies to a specialist rather than accountants generally? And I guess you touched on it there actually, just there previously, in the sense of, you know, you've got the specialist knowledge, the understanding, the designated team to help support these areas, so that, you know, all the queries and worries are put to rest to some extent. But I'll hand that back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably say that again. I mean, really, it was introduced in 2000 R&D. There's been tax legislation changes every year since. So it is a complex matter. Using people who work day in, day out in R&D are clearly going to understand the scheme more than somebody who has to be a generalist across all accounting and tax. Now, I can appreciate that some people may not want to pay for a specialist fee, but my counter to that would be a claim that we would undertake will probably be maximised versus a claim that somebody else might make who doesn't necessarily understand the rules. There are certain aspects of R&D that allow the inclusion of an entire project, even if it's nothing new, if it forms part of a project. And those are the types of things that non-specialists will miss, or they don't include. I mean, we have a lot of people who we advise how to maximise claims by reimbursing expenses, but a lot of other accountants will just miss that, and it can be significant. And I think, I say get what the age-old adage, you get what you pay for. I think that specialists would do probably a more in-depth and a job of maximising the claim rather than somebody who isn't as experienced.
Yeah, no, and I think you touched on it at the start as well. It was certainly very interesting for me to see the kind of the amounts and the funds that we're talking about here. And of course, you know, where there's lesser numbers involved, obviously that's going to come down. But just as a general picture, to see certainly the percentage, I think the 130%, if I was listening rightly, I'm being tested now. You know, that's quite a considerable amount. So there's advantages and you know, serious benefits here that we're talking about. So
I think the main point to mention is that if you're already doing R&D, you're already taking products or creating a new product line, and this is where people tend to miss the R&D. If you're already doing it, then it's just extra finance, extra funding for the company. You know, if you're sat here thinking, should I do this? That's probably a different discussion. But I think both HMRC and tax advisors across the breadth of the UK would suggest that there's plenty of other companies out there who could make a claim who simply don't.
No, brilliant. That's a good point, and perhaps a poignant point to end on as well. Great summary there. So look, we're approaching the end of the webinar. I'm conscious that everyone may have more Zooms to join next. I think you're all backpacking Zooms one on top of another of late. But look, great to have you here today, Jenny. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks to Azets for partnering with us on this webinar. And again, if anyone has any questions related to tax matters, related to the topics we've discussed today, or any accountancy related queries, then again, please do speak to Azets, and there'll be a follow-up email that we'll send out after this with details beyond today as well. And I think, Jenny, you've shared your details, and I think again they'll be in the follow-up email should anyone want to pick anything up with you directly. But again, yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. Thanks to all the participants today for joining us. You know, keep in touch. We hope to see you again soon. More importantly, we perhaps hope to see you in person again soon when we can start doing these events in person. Who knows when that will be? We haven't got any dates just yet, but hopefully later in the year we'll be back doing events as we have done as things start to reopen and lockdown easing continues. But have a great day, everyone. Have a great week. Keep in touch, and hope to see everyone again soon. But thank you, everyone.